All right, welcome everyone to today's panel discussion, the role of philanthropy in democracy. My name is Jenna Dresner. I am the Senior Director of Growth and Impact at Citizen Data, and I'll be hosting and moderating today's panel. A quick note that today's conversation is public and being recorded, and the recording will be available after the event. For those of you who do not know Citizen Data, we are a nonpartisan data research and tools company. We work with partners who look to transcend differences, improve lives, and drive sustainable policy solutions for a stronger and more responsive democracy. Given the work that we do and the broad definition of democracy that we take, we at Citizen are naturally positioned at the corner of many really fascinating and important intersections within the democracy field. And with our entire organizational goal towards a stronger and more responsive democracy, we are constantly looking for ways to bring those intersections to light so that we can all benefit from one another's wisdom and really strengthen one another's tactics in the process. A couple of months ago, we kicked off our webinar series to do just that, speaking with partners at Urban Institute, Leadership Now, and Microsoft about the role of business in democracy. And today we are excited to be continuing our series with the topic that is obviously one of tremendous importance to the democracy field, and that is the role of philanthropy in democracy. Today we'll be joined by three experts on the topic, who I'll be introducing to you all momentarily. And we'll very quickly get into the panel discussion where we'll cover everything from how philanthropies view democracy, their organization's unique role in the space, considerations when it comes to funding democracy endeavors, and much more. Our audience today includes a wide variety of stakeholders, from philanthropists to practitioners and everyone in between. So our conversation will cover a topic for everyone. However, we will absolutely leave 15 minutes at the end for your Q&A. We intentionally set up this conversation to allow for the most opportunity to get your questions answered. So I recommend putting your questions into the Q&A function early, and I'll read out your name and org if you include it. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to provide just 2 slides of context and consideration to carry into this conversation that will sort of contextualize why we're here today. What do we mean when we say democracy? It is not a question I'll answer, but one that we should consider as we hear from our panelists. The chart depicting some of Citizen's research on the topic is meant to reflect that even the word democracy holds different meanings to different people with no clear consensus, especially amongst people with different ideologies. So if you are someone who works within the democracy space, you know this very well. However, I think that we can come to a shared understanding. This image from our friends over at PACE, who we'll be hearing from momentarily, helps us to contextualize at least one way to frame the multidimensional, multifaceted nature of democracy, one that includes everything from election administration to media and journalism to civic rights and bridge building. As I introduce our panel next, one of our first topics of conversation will be around their definitions of democracy and the ways their work contributes so that we can come to contextualize and understand how we all fit together. So without further ado, I will start to introduce our panel. First off, we are introducing Zack Huffman. Zack joins us in his capacity as the Director of Courageous Collaborations at Stand Together Trust. Zack has held a variety of leadership positions in the Stand Together community over the past decade, and will be transitioning to a new role as Senior Director of Strategy and Impact at Stand Together Music. Stand Together, for those of you who don't know, is a philanthropic community that empowers the boldest change makers to tackle the root causes of our country's biggest problems. Next is Tonia Wellons. Tonia is the President and CEO of the Greater Washington Community Foundation, the largest public foundation in the region that ignites the power of philanthropy, leads for community impact, and responds to critical community needs. They have invested more than $1.5 billion since 1973 to build racially equitable, just, and thriving communities where everyone prospers. And last but not least, Kristen Cambell, who is CEO of PACE, a philanthropic laboratory for funders seeking to maximize their impact on democracy and civic life in America. PACE, whose long name is Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, is a member-centric philanthropic laboratory for funders seeking to maximize their impact on democracy and civic life in the United States. So I'm very excited to have you all here. I'd love for all of the panelists to come on video. And as promised, I'd love to start the conversation around democracy itself and how we're defining it so that we can come to a shared definition just on this panel itself. So I obviously didn't do your organization's work justice in my brief introductions. I would love to start the panel with each of you introducing yourselves, a little bit more about your organization and its priorities and how you see those priorities contributing to our democracy. And Kristen, since we most recently referenced PACE's matrix, I'd love to kick it off with you.
Thanks so much, Jenna, for having me, and thank you all for being part of this conversation today. As Jenna mentioned, PACE, we operate as a membership organization where we bring our members together to share with each other what they're investing in, why, and what they're learning from it, in order to find opportunities for shared learning and also to provide platforms for experimentation and collaboration among our members. Our members are really diverse in in a lot of ways. We have some large national systems change oriented funders. We have some smaller place-based and community foundations, but all of our members share a belief that America will be healthier and more productive, resilient, and successful if our democracy is strong and if the office of citizen is treated as central to how democracy functions. So as you might have gleaned in the image that Jenna shared that really offers kind of our orientation to democracy, we see democracy as being something that is much, much broader than politics, which we think and realize that politics is perhaps the easiest way sometimes to think about democracy, like politics and things that influence government and get people involved in the process of influencing government and influencing policy. And it certainly is those things. And it is also things that are about helping people be part of building the communities that they want to be part of, whether those communities are defined as geographic or a shared place, a shared issue, interest, a shared identity. And that gives us the kind of broader frame to think about a more de Tocquevillian sense of democracy, if you will, things that are about civil society, about helping neighbors, about volunteerism and dialogue. So really thinking broadly about the office of citizen. And that's why when we think about democracy, we think about those 5 buckets of democracy, a healthy democracy, including mechanisms for responsive and representative policymaking, fair processes, information and media, social cohesion, and empowered citizenship. And so that gives us, I think, a pretty broad way to think about it and to show the real diversity of ways that funders can show up and invest and use their leadership towards democracy.
Zack, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks everyone for being here today, and Jenna and Citizen Data for hosting the panel, and excited to be alongside Kristen and Tonia today. So I would say that how we first of all describe ourselves at Stand Together as a philanthropic community of both investors, and which are primarily business leaders for us that care about a wide variety of issues. Those range from everything from economic progress to criminal justice to immigration, the work that we do on my team at the Free Speech and Peace team. And so the way that we help drive change, though, is by partnering with those that are closest to the problems that we're trying to solve in society, because we have a very deep and fundamental belief that people who are closest to those problems are the people that are best positioned to solve them. And so we view our role as empowering those folks. So we take a very civil society oriented approach, and we look at society through sort of 4 key institutions that as we call it. So business, government, education, and then communities broadly defined. And so I think we would see democracy as all of those things working in concert with one another to drive positive change for people at all different positions of society.
And Tonia.
Great, thanks, Jenna. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate you all having me here today. So the Greater Washington Community Foundation, like many community foundations around the country, we are a public trust. We are really organized by our ability to galvanize philanthropy through individual giving and individual funds, donor advised funds, field of interest funds, by people who care about a particular set of issues and or specific community. And then we work with them to advise them and other public entities, private entities, on how to make deep investments in community. I'll say that, one of the most amazing things that we get to do as a community foundation is really listen deeply to community voice. It's really keeping a pulse on the specific and unique needs that people in community have articulated, that our nonprofits have identified, and making sure that they are highlighted, centered in the context of philanthropic giving and of philanthropic priorities, which is what we have the great benefit of doing here in the Greater Washington region. I will share a little bit in the context of our conversation about some of the ways that we've been able to do that. But we'll spend a little time talking about how we've framed our new strategic vision around increasing mobility and closing the racial wealth gap directly in response to what members of this community have expressed in terms of their needs.
Awesome. And thank you all for so much for sharing. And just to uplift something that Zack said, which is that we're sort of focusing on partnering with those who are closest to the problem. And that was something that I heard you all kind of talk about in one way or the other, this sort of civic, community-centric approach. And that brings me to the main next topic of discussion I'd love to get all of your feedback on, which is that you each approach this work very differently. And your organizations sort of have a unique philosophy, but it's also sort of grounded in a really similar idea. And Kristen, not to make you go first again, but perhaps starting with PACE's unique model. PACE has been focused on building this philanthropic laboratory that allows funders to maximize their impact through this participatory and actionable learning. But how have you seen that laboratory has changed philanthropy's approach when funding democracy and civic engagement projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we reoriented towards being a philanthropic laboratory from what people, I think we used to call ourselves a learning collaborative back in the day, and it was really about our theory of change and our theory of engagement has always been about relationships tied to learning, tied to action. And one of the things that we were hearing from our members was that they really valued the relationships that they were able to build within the network and the opportunities for learning that created, but they were looking for more opportunities to collaborate with each other. And sometimes that might mean, pooling funding and doing some shared, actual grant making collaboration. And sometimes it might be about things that are more about like testing assumptions and challenging our ideas of what does it mean to have knowledge about what works in philanthropy? How do we make sure that we're not reinforcing some of the same power dynamics and challenges that we say that we're trying to solve for? When are we getting mired in our own tendencies to know what is right and what the problems are and what the solutions are to them? And how do we break out of some of those bubbles that we might naturally find ourselves in order to really challenge and diversify the ways of our ways of being, our ways of knowing, and our ideas of where good ideas come from and what is worthy of our investment. And so the shift to the laboratory orientation was intentional in order to provide more opportunities for collaboration and experimentation, and to also reflect some of the principles that we know are really important in a racially equitable culture as well, to challenge our own assumptions, to get out of there's one right way to do this mindset, to elevate multiple ways of knowing and bring multiple perspectives to the table. And so that's what that evolution has really meant for us. And said perhaps more plainly, it's a way for us to try to be more democratic in how we operate, in addition to supporting democracy as a value and an issue that we care about.
Yeah, I love that a lot. The idea of being more democratic in and of yourself to simulate the environment that we work in. And it brings me to Zack, because I know Stand Together Trust similarly approaches collaboration as a priority. So I'm interested, especially given where you work, especially given that philanthropic organizations often have different priorities and agendas. How do you approach that collaboration with other philanthropic entities to maximize your impact in the space?
Yeah, for sure. So for us, similar to what Kristen just said, we approached democracy, at least at first, and still it's the primary lens, is trying to get us out of this moment of toxic division that we find ourselves in, and then ultimately create a long-term culture of pluralism, one where people of all different backgrounds, beliefs, identities can have a real space and lane to participate fully in civic life, and that their perspectives are appreciated and included in the direction that we head as a country, right? So we obviously are not going to be able to do that all ourselves. We don't have all that knowledge, all those resources or expertise. So for us, living that vision out begins by collaborating with people that do think very differently than we do. that have different capabilities and resources and talents to bring to bear than what we do. And so even from the very beginning of our work, we really got started in this lane in earnest in 2017 following the tragedy in Charlottesville. And we just said, like, with this moment as a country is reaching a fever pitch, we can't not, step in and try and help do something. But we leaned on partners like the Anti-Defamation League and folks at Soros and others that had been working in this space for much longer than we had, to really get a lay of the land and learn where we could engage. And so for people that are interested in doing that, I would encourage you to do the same. And then from there, we partnered with a number of different research institutions to help us really wrap our arms around all the different contours of the problem. Everyone from Kurt Gray at UNC Chapel Hill, understanding like what is the sort of like biological and psychological root of division, and where does that come from, all the way to partners like folks at Dartmouth that are really wrapping their hands and arms around sort of like what is driving toxic polarization and partisan animus. And then from there, then we sought out the community and social entrepreneurs on the ground who have been working to solve this problem for a long time, and really took a landscape study of what do you need, what are resources that if you could unlock, it would like transform your business. And that's how we really arrived at the strategy that we did today. And so, I would just encourage others to think about those kind of collaboration opportunities.
That's, I think, really important guidance. And, talking about sort of the root of the problem, Tonia, I think the Greater Washington Foundation also is really focused on the root, the community and what the community needs, and looking at some of these issues through a very specific lens. And as philanthropic organizations, like Greater Washington Foundation are trying to support things in the democratic process, how can they effectively engage with and learn from these communities that they're looking to serve? And maybe it's through collaboration, as we sort of heard as an opportunity, but to ensure that their efforts are responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people they're looking to impact.
Sure, absolutely, Jenna. I'll build on Zack's theme of partnership and Kristen's theme of sort of the democratization, for us, democratization of philanthropy. Nothing that we can do meaningfully as a community foundation happens in isolation. It really does happen in direct partnership with state and local government for us, actually federal government, since we national government, since we sit at the seat of the nation's capital, in the seat of the nation's capital. It requires that we work really, really closely with the business community, the private sector. Nonprofits are our normal go-to, because it's through them that we're able to realize some of the community investment interventions that we are pursuing. And then it's directly with people. We have tried very hard, both at the Community Foundation, but also as a sector, locally and nationally, to really figure out how we invite more people to the philanthropic table. We've looked at a number of strategies, including strategies like trust-based philanthropy, which became increasingly popular during the context of the pandemic, where we really needed to move resources quickly to people who needed them most. We learned that many of the organizations that were closest to the people in need were not organizations that may have been on our radar prior to the pandemic. And so it is required that we do more things to center the experiences of those with lived experience and invite them to the review table. How do we get people with lived experience sitting at the table, advising us on the nonprofits that they are who are having the most impact in their community, on the issues that we need to focus on, and then paying them for their expertise in much the same way that we would pay consultants to do the same. A lot of foundations are moving toward participatory grant making, where the entire review team is made up of members of community who are making decisions about where resources are allocated. And then the one that I think is closest to my heart is the work of deep listening. Of really making sure that we keep a finger on the pulse of how people are experiencing life in our region, what their interactions with government and government systems look like, how they are faring in terms of their relationships with the police, with nonprofits. What are their prospects for the future? And really asking questions. We've had the benefit of doing some work over the last 6 years now, polling work with Urban Institute first, and then later on with Gallup, where it's a body of work we refer to as Voices DMV, where we ask people every 2 years how they're doing, how they're faring, what are the conditions that they are experiencing, which informs how we think about the work that we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And that's really where I'd like to continue the conversation, which is around this idea of deep listening. And I think that, and perhaps it's my opinion, that sometimes the needs of everyday Americans gets lost when we're talking about ideas as broad and complex as democracy. And many of the organizations that are watching today are practitioners in the field of democracy and are always sort of interested to think about how philanthropies consider which democracy-related projects to support. But my sort of tag-along question to this is, how can we ensure these democracy-related projects are aligned with the needs and aspirations of the communities that we're looking to serve? And this is a question for all of you. If anyone wants to jump in, otherwise I'll assign it. You know, Tonia, maybe, or Kristen, go for it. I was just gonna say, Tonia, maybe talking a little bit about some of the tactics you've already taken about having people on in a conversation, paying them like employees. You know, there's a lot already that you've surfaced, but would love to sort of put it to you first.
Sure. I'll give another example and then I'll come back to it. But we just announced 2 days ago a $12.5 million investment in about 14 organizations in DC specifically. And the entire motivation for this portfolio, this new portfolio, is around systems change and policy advocacy. And we're super excited because it is rare that in philanthropy you're able to make multi-year investments, and these grants are 4-year grants that are large in scope and size, that they're general operating, but they're with organizations who are taking a specific slice of a various policy agenda from health equity perspective, from a reentry perspective, and looking at all the policy barriers that are preventing people with low incomes and various barriers in life from fully participating and thriving in civic life. One of the interesting things that I'm excited about with this round of funding is the expectation that there is a policy agenda that they will work on together. So that's sort of the outcome of a process. But even in getting to the process, to the nonprofits who were selected, we included, of course, experts in philanthropy, policy experts, and members of community who have experienced some of the barriers and challenges that we're looking to have removed as part of the review team and as part of the review process. And we paid them a fee in much the same way that we would a consultant for their expertise, for their opinions. I think it's super important that as we are looking to center community voice, that we not extract from those experiences by not compensating people accordingly. I'll quickly touch on. Actually, let me just defer to Kristen, and then I'll come back with a few other thoughts.
Sure. I'm really glad that Tonia started, actually, because I think that tees up a couple of points that I wanted to make. I think there are a couple of things that we really see as opportunities for funders in this space in terms of like really understanding community needs and making sure that communities are centered in identifying both the problems that they think are most important to address and the solutions to those problems. And one is to lead with questions and invest in processes. The second is to take a relational approach to systems change work. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean on both of those. On the leading with questions and investing in process, Tonia, this goes to your point too around like lived experience. I think as philanthropy, we sometimes have a tendency to say, We have the research. We funded the research. We know the things about the things that are creating the problems in this community. And that can be really true. And data and empirical evidence only tells us so much. There's a lot that does not come to the surface that usually does revolve around lived experience, or what the Rockefeller Brothers Fund calls earned knowledge. Knowledge that we earned through our experience, not necessarily through an academic enterprise. And so sometimes, I'll give one example of a group that I worked with in Arizona a number of years ago. There was a bunch of funders who really wanted to support single mothers in this like specific neighborhood in Arizona. And so they looked at all of the research and they said, we need better neonatal programs here. We need better, mentorship. We need after school. We need transportation. Like, we need all of these things. And so they like invested in all of those things, and none of the people in the community took advantage of it. And they were like, why is this the case? We know that these are problems and barriers that people are experiencing. And somebody finally had the foresight to say, have we asked the single mothers in this community what it is that they need? And they were like, no, actually, we didn't. And so when they went to the people that were the ultimate beneficiaries of what they were trying to do, and they said, what is it that you need? They said, we actually need you to help with the stray dog population in the neighborhood, because there are so many stray dogs here that might have diseases that our kids can't play outside, they can't walk to school, and they can't wait for the school bus, which assumes that we have transportation to be able to drive them to school, which assumes that we have a flexible enough work schedule that we can drive them to school, which assumes, and so it was like all of these things. So it wasn't that the mothers in that community didn't also need all of the things that the empirical evidence told the funders that they needed. It was an order of operations issue. There was a first barrier to entry that was not removed in order to be able to take advantage of all of those other things. And that's something that like data is not going to tell us. We have to talk to people to be able to understand that. So like, that's one example of what I mean by like leading with questions and investing in processes, so that you can actually understand what it is that's happening there that you just might not have the proximity or the insight to be able to see. I think also leading with questions, another example that we see from work of like the Kettering Foundation, for example, that invests in lots of dialogue efforts, is there's often very well-intentioned solutions-oriented processes that say things like, how do we support, one specific example, there was a group that was trying to support community safety. And they wanted to have a dialogue around how to improve relationships between police officers and members of a community. And so they were tempted to frame the dialogue as, how do we improve relationships between police officers and the community? But that's a really hard question to like get your head around, and it automatically sets up a binary of, are you on the side of the police or are you on the side of the community? So instead, they framed the conversation as, how do we make sure that everyone comes home safely? And what that does is it creates a much wider frame for good faith perspectives to be brought to the table. And if you disagree with the premise of that question, you probably have a whole other problem that dialogue is not going to solve for, right? And so it like really helps in some ways simplify and in some ways complexify what it is that we're actually trying to understand when we lead with questions in that way. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet for a minute, is I think there's a relational approach to systems change that funders can invest in and think about that often goes overlooked. When we think about system change, we tend to think about structures and institutions and policy reform, and all of those things are super important, and systems are people. People make up systems. And so if we're not thinking about the questions of like, how do hearts and minds evolve? And how do people experience systems and institutions, and what are the actual human nature challenges that are associated with the systemic and structural problems that we are experiencing, then we're missing a big part of the solution. So I'm going to send a couple of pieces on some of the things that I just talked about. I'll chat them to Grayson, and hopefully he'll be able to either put them in the chat or put them in the follow-up notes after. But just a couple of far more thoughtful and far more in-depth pieces that can help go into some of the dynamics that I'm referencing.
Thank you. That was super robust. And Tonia, did you want to jump back in?
I can wait. It's okay.
Okay, perfect. Well, I do want to stay on the line of asking questions in this relational approach, and thinking about, Zack, your team's work, collaborating with other organizations, but also research institutions and different types of stakeholders. How do you see that, maybe in response to what Kristen's been sharing, whether or not you agree, or just your approach to working with these partners to ask these kinds of questions to drive that kind of change in the democratic process?
Yeah, I mean, if you double click on everything that both Tonia and Kristen said, I mean, I think that when we're looking at the different layers and levers of how change happens, right? Yes, we need to be working from both the bottom up and the top down. So like you have to have a theory of change about what is driving the problem at a meta level, but you cannot disconnect that from the very real lived experiences of people on the ground who are going through this day in and day out. So we really try and look at both, and not to say that that the previous speakers don't. It's just that with us, that's how we try and marry the two. And so for us at that meta level, yeah, we partner with a lot of research institutions to try and look at core drivers, right? So for us, with the greater toxic division problem that we have, the sort of democratic backsliding that we have, there's sort of four major research areas that I would say we've both invested in and sort of have looked at. So the first one I would say is really around like partisan animus and toxic polarization. We've looked at partners like Polarization Research Lab, who I mentioned earlier at Dartmouth, and a bunch of others to figure out like, okay, what's actually driving this both perception and reality of division. The second piece is democratic norms, and then unfortunately at the far end of the backslide on democratic norms is political violence. So we've invested in partners like the Bridging Divide Initiative at Princeton, and others to really assess like what is that democratic norm landscape look like, and then on the political violence side, what does that landscape look like, and how can we then help communities hopefully build resilience against those kinds of trends. And then over the long term, two of the things that we're really concerned about too are social trust and sort of the economic cost of polarization. So for social trust, it's something that's been sort of in a backslide in our country for really since it was measured consistently in the late 1960s. And it's only gotten worse in the last 10 years, especially. And so communities are not going to be able to get to a place of then repair and then ultimately progress if ultimately neighbors don't trust one another, right? And so it's an area that we are really trying to dive into and understand what's driving that, again, both at a meta level as well as at a grounded community level too. And then the economic cost of polarization is important to us because I think if we're really going to be able to get the business community to rally around solving this problem, you have to make it real for them and show them like so they can help make their business case both to their boards, their investors, their stakeholders. Because from what we've seen, I mean, just this week, research from Rachel Kleinfeld, who's an expert that we respect a lot in this space, came out showing that populist governments and democratic backsliding has very, very real economic costs. And she took a global, perspective in her analysis, but I think that that's sort of like the type of work that we need more of. And then also working with communities to say, okay, it's different when you're looking at a country's GDP during backsliding. It's different when you're looking at what maybe business opportunities are not present to people that are already trying to economically improve their lives because they don't feel they have a degree of relationship with other people in their communities. That's like a very real human cost to what we're dealing with right now. So yeah, we try and look at both the meta and the grounded level.
Yeah, I appreciate the reference on social networks and the sort of the challenge that polarization is having in preventing us from building those. I wanted to make the point, if it's all right, Jenna, around our Voices DMV survey, which we conduct every 2.5 years, and we offer it as a public good. So our ambition is that we provide the funding for this survey. We work with our partner at Gallup right now to do this work, to do statistically significant sampling across socioeconomic lines and across our geography. And that's super important because oftentimes when I'm talking about this work, I am talking about centering community voice, but it's community in the broadest way of describing it. It's, those who are doing incredibly well and faring well, high net worth individuals, and those with lower incomes across geography, across socioeconomics. One key thing that we try and make sure that we do is listen for need and opportunity, right? So not just the things that we have to kind of solve for, but what are the other ways that we can win hearts and minds to shift conditions, perspectives, and opportunities. I'll share one quick example. We asked a question around the issue of homelessness in the nation's capital, and we were specific to say, would you be willing to pay more in taxes in order to provide additional shelter or housing, permanent supportive housing for people who are experiencing homelessness? And overwhelmingly, the majority of people across socioeconomic lines and geographies said absolutely yes, which was data that informed our DC Council in thinking about an additional wealth tax. Not that it's popular with everyone, but they said we're willing to pay a little bit more so that we can provide more resources ongoing for people who are experiencing homelessness. And so the listening to community voice is really about identifying need and also about leaning into to opportunity, expressed opportunity.
Tonia, I think you touched on something really important, which is like helping people understand what trade-offs are worth it and like at least consider what trade-offs are worth it. That's one of the things I think the National Issues Forum does pretty well, and a lot of the issue guides that they put out, where they offer like discussion frameworks. And it's like, okay, these are the things that if this is what we want, what are we willing to give up in order to achieve that? What do we hope we will gain from that? And it just helps have a more informed discussion that is really focused on the implications of what people are and are not willing to do, and not just I don't want to say just but like gets a little bit beyond the like sound bites and talking points of, well, you don't care about these people, you don't support this, you won't do that. It's like, what will we actually do? What are we actually willing to do? And I think people, to illustrate the example you just gave, a lot of people are willing to do a lot of things that people don't give them credit for because they've just never been asked, and it's been treated as though there are false choices rather than that people can actually hold the complexity around some of these decision points and make calculated decisions based on values and based on impact and opportunity and cost associated with it.
Yeah, thanks for that addition, Kristen. I do want to shift gears, but Zack, just want to see if you had anything to add on to that conversation, but before we sort of move towards an impact conversation.
No, and I think we did a good job covering it. I'm excited to dig into the impact pieces. I'm sure some listeners are too, so we can keep moving.
Perfect. And that's great because my first question is for all of you, but I did want to start with you, Zack. So, when we're talking about impact, I think a lot of questions come up about, the immediate impact of all the needs that are most pressing versus longevity. How are we ensuring a strong democracy in the future? And when we're talking about democracy in the future, this is sort of a question that will never end. So I guess my question for everyone, but starting with you, Zack, what are the most effective strategies for measuring the impact and success of a philanthropic investment when strengthening democracy?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on sort of at what level the program or intervention or funding is taking place at, right? So if you're investing in a small scale neighborhood community conversation program, that's going to look very different than if you're investing in, let's say, like trying to shift an entire given audience or institution towards stronger democratic norms, right? But to me, one of the things that I do return to pretty regularly is really three things: engagement, behavior, and then ultimately norms. So, like with democracies don't work if all people are not given both a path to and then take active participation in those democratic processes, right? So I think the first thing we have to look at is that in those engagement metrics and numbers, right? So in a community, again, that looks like, are citizens actually being able to have a root to and taking an active role in, let's say, everything from school board conversations all the way to how we're solving, to Tonia's point, homelessness in a given community or neighborhood. And if people aren't engaging, then we might have an initial layer of problem to look at. The second then is then how are they engaging, right? Is it sort of a level of productive engagement that is trying to collaborate across lines of difference, push for progress for those who most need it, actively listen to others in their community, and really sort of living out what we would call to be pluralistic values. And then thirdly, I think, and sort of at the most meta level, it's, are then our institutions, both in communities and as a country, codifying those behaviors as the way that we would like to engage with one another and as we would want to see our democracy lived out. So those are sort of like the three layers that I often look at. And again, happy to dive into more specifics and questions. I want to make sure I give time for others to speak, but I think there's a specific battery of measures that you can look at within those three layers too.
Kristen, anything you would add on that, especially when thinking about perhaps long-term investments and focusing on how to make an impact that's sustained, especially when political landscapes are shifting?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this. I'm going to try to keep it brief. I read a piece by Adam Grant in the New York Times a couple of years ago, and it was basically, I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but basically the quote was, sometimes when we are dealing with very significant and real and consequential challenges, our temptation is to say we must solve this by any means necessary. But we must remember that means are a measure of our character. And so we should ask ourselves, if we are able to achieve something that we are proud of, are we equally proud of how we achieved it? And I think that that's something that's really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about impact, especially long-term impact, is sometimes we hear often that sometimes philanthropy can have a propensity or a tendency to fund things that feel like wins in the short term, potentially to the detriment of the long-term health and vibrancy of communities and society. And I want to highlight a piece that actually just was published in the Chronicle on Philanthropy today by somebody who's been invoked already, Rachel Kleinfeld, as well as Shamil Idris, where they talk about, they suggest to funders to consider a peace impact framework that lays out the vital signs for a healthy society. And that framework includes measuring the impact on things like trust in people and governing institutions, citizens' sense of agency, levels of physical violence, and commitments to sustained peace. And they go on to say these crucial variables measure both the health and resilience of a society, whether it's more likely to rally in the face of crises or decline into further polarization and violence. Activists and philanthropists should assess their interventions based on their impact on these variables to support those that yield positive change and steer clear of those that fuel further deterioration in any of these areas. And I think that that's something that we think about a lot, is we do tend to, for all sorts of reasons that are like really fair and valid, we think about like, what is the win now? What is the impact now? What are we trying to achieve now? And that is very important because problems are real and urgent and consequential and have real impacts on people's lives. And the way that we address them might actually make those problems worse in the long term, or have unintended consequences that manifest in any number of other problems. And so the contribution that I would make to this question is measuring impact is really hard, but I think it's important to think about not just what we do, but how we do it, because ends matter, but the means to those ends, especially in thinking about impact on democracy, matter just as much.
Tonia, anything you want to add to this conversation before we shift into audience questions? But thank you, Kristen. I'm really thinking about that context of, are we sacrificing the win later for the win now? And I think that's really important.
I'll only add
and who decides?
Oh, sorry, please.
No, I was just going to say, sorry. And who decides? Who decides if the win now is more important than the win later? Like there are consequences and trade-offs of all of this. And I think there's an opportunity for funders to really make sure that they're engaging community and people closest to the issues in understanding and navigating some of those trade-offs and prioritizing accordingly. I'm so sorry, go ahead.
No, I can't wait to read the article. Zack and Kristen are ahead of me. So I'm gonna spend some time this afternoon looking forward to take a read. But I appreciate the paced impact framework language. It really does describe, I think, what an opportunity for all of us in philanthropy to really kind of stick with some things for a while. I'm very pleased that my board of trustees very recently approved a 10-year strategic plan for the community foundation, because some of the work that we're aiming to do can't be done in 3 to 5 years. Actually, probably won't get done in 10 years. And so really thinking through what are the wins along the way that we can point to as successes, and really thinking about how we build on those is important for any foundation engaged in this long-term and important work for our community.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And we do have a ton of questions from our audience, so we'll dive into a few of those, as many as we have time for. But as Grayson mentioned in the chat, if we don't get to your question, if you send them to Grayson, we will direct you the right place and make sure you get your question answered. Some of these questions were submitted earlier, so you might not see them pop up once we answer them. But the first one is from Madeline Dubeck from Change, Illinois, who said, it's getting tougher for nonprofits to secure funding for local and state democracy reform work. What advice do you have for us?
I've got a specific answer, and then I've got a broader answer. The very specific answer is there's a couple different funder collaboratives that I know that are really going to be taking a keen interest in this over the next several years. One to keep your eye on is a group called the New Pluralists. The grant program that they just announced called Healing Starts Here is all about exactly that, trying to uncover the local solutions and locally driven healers for this kind of larger problem, and then ultimately to the larger health of our democracy over the long term. I know there's going to be more installments of that. This is not the only installment, so keep your eye on that group specifically. But then over the long haul, I know that this question of sort of like civic infrastructure and national civic trust is really emerging, in the world of funders. And so I don't believe the one that I have in mind, I don't think has been publicly announced yet. So I don't want to get ahead of anyone, but there's going to be a large organization or collective effort around that. And I know that they are focused on a number of different things along that same line of work, everything from rural communities specifically, all the way to just local communities broadly defined.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. The next question we had was, sorry, I was deciding which question, but how do you see the relationship between countering authoritarianism and building a democracy for the 21st century? It's obviously a big question.
Kristen, I know you've got lots of thoughts on this one, so I'll let you go first, and then I might follow up just directly after.
I think one of the things, there are many potential answers and considerations and factors into this question. One of the things that I think is really important as we think about what is required of us today to combat authoritarianism is there's a lot of research that shows that one of the things that is one of the greatest bulwarks to authoritarianism is having a strong civil society, and a strong civil society in which people feel that their voice is heard and valued and respected, that there is a sense of inclusion and belonging, and that people can solve problems themselves, in addition to knowing that government can and that institutions can, but that people can see themselves as agents of change and agents of solving the problems that are most important to them. And one of the reasons that that's so important is it helps people understand that you don't need a strong man who will say, I alone can fix this, which is one of the hallmarks of authoritarianism. Our leaders that kind of put forward that idea that I can solve this, I can do it for you. These things are so hard and intractable that you can't possibly do it, so just trust me. Give me the power to do it for you. Don't worry, I got it. And like, that is really a hallmark of authoritarianism. And so people seeing the sense of agency of people being able to solve problems without necessarily the interventions of government or the interventions of institutions helps people have greater faith in democracy as a system of self-governance and being of, by, and for the people. And so I think as we think about the challenges that we are experiencing and facing right now, which of them need to have policy solutions and systemic and structural solutions, which are actually more matters of like culture and human nature and the ways that we relate to each other and the ways that we empower people to build the communities that they want to be part of. And how do we do that in a way that does show that democracy matters, that it works, that it delivers, and that people matter in it. And I think doing those things will help people resist the tendency towards authoritarianism, which, let's be honest, feels a lot easier than democracy sometimes. Like, I don't know that people are always actively choosing to desire authoritarian tendencies, but it feels a lot easier and simple and cleaner. And we know that democracy is harder and messier and more complex. So we have to help people value that when it would just be easier to say, fine, somebody else can do it.
Yeah, I mean, just big double click on everything that Kristen just said. And I think that, again, it's probably not the most satisfying answer in the world, but my answer to the question would be it is a both and. I don't think that you have to look at it as an either or. I think if you're a foundation or a grant making entity, look at the capabilities that you have to figure out like where you might be able to make the most impact, and then kind of decide where to put your time and energy and resources. Same thing as if you're a practitioner. But for me, the authoritarianism problem is one that is very top down. It's very elite driven, right? So you've got a number of, and the research it seems to really bear this out too. Elite rhetoric, elite behavior is what is creating this collective illusion that we are in fact more toxically divided than we are. When you look at the data, by far and away, the majority of Americans share a number of values in common. When Populous did their American Aspirations Index, it was definitely over 60, the high 60 percentile of people agreed with 8 of those top 10 aspirations in common. More in Common has a ton of data on this too. And that's not to say that everyone in the middle looks the same. We don't. We're very different. We come from very different backgrounds, perspectives. But the reality is we have far less of a perception gap of one another and where we actually are in relation to our fellow community members than those at the extremes. And those at the extremes benefit from driving this idea that we are, in fact, more toxically divided than we are. And that's where you get democratic norm backsliding, because then they can make the case, well, see, the other side is going to do it, so you have to do it too. And so then that's when you work yourself into this like downward spiral. And so I think to everything that Kristen just said, yeah, there are things that we have to do to sort of change the incentives for elites such that that no longer becomes a way to gain clout, money, fame, influence, whatever it is, because if not, they will continue to be incentivized to do those things. And so
Yeah,
I think we have to do both.
I totally agree. And a resource that I will point people to on this is the work of Amanda Ripley, who wrote a book called High Conflict, which is all about the concept of conflict entrepreneurs, people that, to Zack's exact point, benefit by keeping us divided. And one of the things that she says is that it's really tempting to think about high conflict as a feeling, and it's not a feeling, it is a system. It is a system of structures and incentives and all sorts of things that play a role in making us see each other as the problem instead of the problem as the problem. And one thing that I think, and this kind of gets to a question that Jeff put in the Q&A about, like, is polarization the right frame? Is toxic polarization even the right frame? And Jeff, you've heard me say this a million times before, but like one of the things that I think that funders can do, toxic polarization is a problem when it says you are the problem, or I am not the problem, you are the problem, instead of saying you and I are oriented towards solving this problem together. So toxic polarization is when we see each other as the problem, not necessarily the problem is the problem, and people benefit around that. So like Jeff, actually an example that you gave to me recently was like, the problem is not that we're polarized around guns. The problem is that we have a gun violence problem in the country. The problem is not the polarization around gun ownership, it's the problem of violence. And so if we are reorienting ourselves to the problem of violence and how to solve that, that creates a different opening to the ideas of different solutions to that, which does still include our question about gun ownership and people's relationship to guns and the Second Amendment and all sorts of things. But the problem is not gun owners versus not gun owners. It's the problem of violence and the ways that we are being incentivized to treat each other as the problem instead of coming together to create a solution together.
Thank you, Kristen and Zack. Those were really important questions, and I'm really glad we got to. And I think we likely won't be able to get to any more. We'll need to follow up on a lot of these other questions. They're all really important questions and really complex, and it's just a matter of time here, because I do want to give our panelists a chance to issue any concluding remarks that they might have. So, as a final question and a sort of sign off in our last couple of minutes here, love for you all to go through any final calls to action, but also just any final advice you might issue either to philanthropists or to practitioners in the field to strengthen their work in democracy. Tonia, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you all for the engagement. I really learned a lot from both you and Zack and Kristen. I think there's a unique opportunity for us to shift our own narrative and talk about belonging, to create spaces where people are invited to participate, they're invited to contribute, they're invited to the table. I think that there's an opportunity for philanthropy to really create the space and the opportunity for the preservation, of course, of basic human rights. And again, just thinking about the language that we get to use and introduce into our grant making, into our public discourse, so that it invites more belonging and rejects polarization.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I could have summed it up any better than both Tonia and Kristen in their last two comments. I mean, I think belonging is the long-term frame that we need to be keeping in mind, because that's ultimately when people will be able to fully thrive and participate in a democracy in the way we would hope that they would be able to. And then, Kristen, I just so appreciate what you said about let's keep our focus on the problems themselves and how we can work together to solve them, versus thinking through like how each other is in fact the problem. It's really the other way around. So just appreciate both of those frames.
And I will just offer up the Belonging Barometer is a fantastic new resource that just came out from a group called Over Zero and the American Immigration Council. that actually looks at and assesses people's state of belonging, where they feel they belong, in what context, to what degree. And it's extremely important because belonging is one of the greatest indicators of, and to go back to the question around authoritarianism, people who don't feel a sense of belonging are more likely to support authoritarianism. So there are very significant consequences about belonging that are about feelings that are really important and have implications on so many other systemic and structural things.
Amazing. Thank you all. I cannot thank our panelists, Tonia from the Greater Washington Foundation, Kristen from PACE, and Zack from Stand Together Trust enough. We were only able to get to the first 2 questions today, which tells me we are only scratching the surface on this, and there are many more conversations that need to be had. So I know we'll continue to dive on into these questions together. Please reach out to Grayson if you have a pressing question that didn't get answered, and we will work our hardest to make sure it does. Everyone, thank you for attending, and that concludes today's panel.
Thank you, Jenna. Thanks, team. Bye, friends.
Thank you, Jenna.
Back in Tonia.